Yeah. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Really delighted to welcome back Barry Brown. Last time you visited about 5 years ago, we think.
We think. Yeah, we think.
When you're in Stockholm, and now you've moved to Copenhagen, and we're looking forward to hearing you talk about on movement, designing movement and interaction. Over to you, Barry. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I believe you might have had a recent talk by my colleague, Casper Hornbeck. So you're getting a little bit of a double billing of Copenhagen content. Yeah, so I've moved down to Copenhagen. I've actually been writing lots of horrible review documents recently, and we tend to call ourselves the second best HCI group in Europe. I'm not really sure that's true, but we make that claim anyway. And of course, we always say that you are the first group in Europe. So
you say that in every university you visit.
So if you don't know me, I'm kind of focused on doing user research. And over the years, I've kind of worked a lot on building different kind of technologies, but mainly in my recent work, I've been kind of using video in different ways to look at behavior around technology in different ways. But what I want to focus on today is something I've been spending a little while looking at recently, which is movement, human movement. And I think human movement specifically in public spaces. And I think that's quite a kind of fascinating phenomena, really. I think the fact that we can move through public space on the whole in a fairly orderly way and not bump into each other is kind of quite interesting. And it's something, of course, we do every day and we kind of tend to take for granted. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon, I think, but you might think, what has this got to do with HCI? And I think in recent years, it becomes a bit more of an HCI problem in a number of ways. The first is that we're beginning to work on the design of these kind of things. Robots that are actually inhabiting public place in some way. I obviously came through Heathrow Airport this morning and I came across a cleaning robot, an autonomous cleaning robot that was moving around Heathrow Airport in a not particularly predictable or particularly well-determined way. But we have this problem that we have these robots, they're going to be in public places and they need to in some way move through that public space. We're also currently going through a massive experiment in terms of the deployment of self-driving cars in different forms. So you're probably familiar with Waymo and the kind of experiments that are going on in mainly American cities and of course lots of Chinese cities as well around self-driving cars. But of course, many of our more mundane cars have assisted driving features of different sorts. And self-driving cars are themselves a form of robot. They have to, in a similar way, move through public space and interact with others in that space. And if you think that moving through public space as a pedestrian is complex enough, I think you'll kind of give me the point that moving through traffic is itself an incredibly complex activity. Now, I actually think it's one of the greatest achievements of humans that we actually have managed to produce mainly safe public spaces like this, where you have this incredible combination of different agents coming into the same space with their own vehicles working in their own way. And we managed to pull off mostly safe spaces where we actually managed to get to where we want to through situations like this. There is sometimes this comment where people look at places that maybe are as dense as that and they say, oh, isn't it chaotic? But actually, I think it's very orderly. There's, of course, sometimes pockets of confusion, but on the whole, this is an incredibly orderly accomplishment that we actually managed to get through these kind of spaces. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this talk. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about how we might understand human movement, and in particularly human movement in interaction with others, particularly in public places. And as I say, I'm going to try and sort of explore it, I think, as a human-computer interaction issue, because I think it's actually a very interesting kind of design space where we have to think about how are we actually going to design the motion of these robots, be these self-driving cars or whatever type of robot we might have in a public space. How are we going to design that movement in a way that it doesn't disturb or hinder those public spaces that those technologies are being introduced to? In this talk, I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk about two kind of studies that I've worked on recently, one on self-driving cars and one more recently on robotic trash cans. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to try and talk a little bit about bringing this into the design space. This is a little bit more in progress, so I haven't quite got the money that I need to do this properly, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the design work I've been doing around robots. Now, if you know your HCI, you'll know that I'm clearly not the first person to talk about studying human movement or even human movement with robots. Your London colleagues at King's, of course, pioneered the use of using video based on conversation analysis to try and understand the sort of naturally occurring way that those interactions take place. And in recent years, there's been some kind of interesting kind of turns to that in that kind of area where there's been a real focus on what gets now known as multimodal work, which looks at the combination of the body with talk itself. For many years, the focus, as you can tell by the phrase of conversation analysis, was on talk, but now very much more is this kind of focus on understanding interaction with the body and talk at the same time. So for example, my colleague, Lorenzo Mondada, she's been doing a lot of work on understanding how, for example, people might preempt certain behaviors when they're interacting. So this is a kind of quite fun study she was doing inside what we call them news agents, I guess, in Britain. And she explored how when you have a customer coming in and the customer might look up at where the cigarettes are, and the person behind the counter might actually start moving with their hand over to the cigarettes before the customer has even asked that they want to buy a pack of whatever, Winston Red or whatever cigarettes that they're buying. People preempt and are kind of working with their bodies to actually kind of do things before they actually kind of come off. So there's this really kind of rich resource, I think, to kind of draw in, and you'll start to see that in some of the work I'm going to talk about. But I want to jump on and I want to actually kind of focus on the first case that I've looked at, which I think is kind of an interesting kind of area, because we don't normally think of self-driving cars perhaps as being a case where there's robots interacting, but it has feature very many of the same challenges that we have with robotics generally. Self-driving cars need to understand other road users, need to understand others' movements, and they have to make movements themselves that are in turn going to be understood by those other people who are interacting with them. For a long time, I think there was this kind of assumption that this was a solved problem, to quote Elon Musk, and that we're really going to have like self-driving cars, we're just going to kind of have to be this great success. And we've kind of noticed that even though quite eye-watering amounts of money have been spent on developing these technologies, they're still they still have kind of significant kind of challenges. Chris Urmson, for example, he was the founder of Alphabet self-driving when it was part of Google X. He's actually now much more modest about the impact of self-driving and talks about it gradually occurring over the next 30 to 50 years. And that makes an interesting space for us, because if this is a technology that might be kind of working, then it's a great space for HCI, isn't it? Because we can get in, we can look at it, and we can maybe try and understand where it's going wrong. And that's what I've been doing. I've been looking at different self-driving car systems, specifically the Waymo system, the Tesla system, and the Mobileye system, to try and understand a little bit about what they do and what perhaps even some of the mistakes that they might be making in their interactions on the road. This work here was actually kind of at CAI last year. The paper was called The Halting Problem, and it was trying to actually understand what lessons can we draw from the interactions that people have with these self-driving cars. And particularly, I'm going to talk a lot about one pretty basic road interaction, which is when we yield to other road users. Because it turns out that even though this is a pretty basic operation on the road, self-driving cars still struggle a lot with yielding successfully to other road users. Okay, the data for this paper. So we've collected quite a bit of data ourselves of different self-driving car systems. Particularly, we're kind of working on a paper just now looking at some of the real interesting stuff that's going on in China. They have a quite different approach to some of their self-driving car systems there. But actually, the data that we used for this paper came from YouTube. And I think actually YouTube is perhaps a really underrated resource for getting a first look at some kind of new technology that's out there. And it was particularly useful for these technologies because they are being actually tested on the road, particularly in the US, in different ways. For example, Waymo has been used. When we were looking at it, it was being deployed in Phoenix, in Arizona, and actually, of course, it's been deployed in San Francisco and other cities now as well. And we also made use of data collected by users of the Tesla full self-driving system, which is a similar kind of emergent self-driving technology. Okay, so if I can take you back to a bit of basic, good old-fashioned computer science, you'll remember the halting problem, perhaps. And the title of the paper is a bit of a joke on the halting problem, because if you remember, the halting problem is this, kind of issue that, you can never really have a computer program that can debug itself, because it's always going to, you just basically feed the code of that program into itself, and you can end up with a contradiction. And you have this kind of the halting problem is kind of one of these kind of fundamental challenges of computability. I say it's a joke because the self-driving cars actually have a little bit of the opposite problem. Their problem is that they often just end up halting on the road. Their null operation, when they don't really know what to do, is just to halt. And that causes all kind of problems if you're halting in the middle of the road. And in fact, if you follow any of perhaps the news reports of how these trials have been going on, this is one of the kind of problems these systems have. They'll do things like drive down the street and just stop in the middle of the street, causing a problem for traffic and other road users. So let's jump in and look at this. So I'm making this claim that they're just stopping. Let's see what happens when they actually just stop. This video clip is going to come from a YouTuber called JG Ricks, who's been collecting data of Waymo self-drives. This is him in the back seat here. He has a setup where he sets up some different cameras, so you can see the view inside the car from the kind of information visualization inside the car. This is the Waymo. You'll see that there's no driver there. And we're going to jump in and look at a clip where the self-driving car, the Waymo, has just stopped at a junction and isn't moving.
Oh, so how are we gonna turn right when the right lane is closed off? Or is the planner still wants to go in this lane?
So you'll notice the car is stuck. It wants to go there. You can sort of see there's some traffic cones there that's blocking the way. And actually what happens is the car gets stuck, so the roadside assistance, which is actually somebody who comes out from Waymo, gets called automatically.
Hey, I see there's some funky stuff going on here. Yeah.
So the car is stuck. Some people behind actually start driving around the car, as you'd expect, because you're just blocking the road. And our YouTuber's sitting in the back here waiting for the roadside assistance to come. The Waymo cars actually can't be remotely controlled, but then the car starts to move.
Okay. There you go.
Car actually looks like it is on its way.
Oh, I don't think it was supposed to do that.
And then it stops blocking the road completely now.
Oh, now it's blocking the entire road.
And actually what happens in the end is finally some roadside assistance comes, and the car then decides at that point to start moving, and the roadside assistance has to chase the car down the road to catch it up. So I've talked about this being this halting problem, that self-driving cars stop in inappropriate points on the road. Now, I'm not trying to do a review of self-driving cars. Obviously, the technology has changed a lot since these videos were made, and indeed the technology is moving really quickly. But my point is actually I'm trying to understand a little bit about what it tells us about the difficulties of driving in traffic, and particularly this problem of interacting with other road users, because it's actually a problem that many of the systems have, is understanding the interaction that we have as part of being able to drive properly. Because stopping in the road is an interaction. It's yielding. And actually, when we look at some work, for example, this is some work by Pentti Addington and Mirka Runoaka, who's actually they've been doing work on looking at ordinary road interactions with any self-driving cars. And they've done work, for example, looking at this basic unit of yielding, understanding how we yield to other road users. And it's pretty important that you can yield, that one of you is going to stop, and one of you is going to go, or you're going to go and the other person is going to stop. This can get even more complicated. So I'm going to play another clip here where the Waymo is so hesitant that it gets stuck in a kind of yo-yo loop with some pedestrians out the side of who are walking at the side of the road. So this is, here we go, I'll play this one. Okay, let me focus in on this one so you can see it a bit better. So a family are getting ready to cross the road. As the car approaches the junction, the Waymo decelerates. And as the car is stopping, the mother holds out her hand to stop the children, and the father kind of does this thing. You saw this kind of beckoning here for the car to pass. And let's see what happens now.
Sorry, self-driving car. It sees you, so no worries about that.
The car does successfully get around the junction. I have to say it's safe as it makes its way around this junction here, but we can perhaps see that the fact that the chap in the back has to wind down the window and apologize for the car not moving, that maybe it isn't quite kind of going as well as it could. One of the things I want to point out to, and I kind of, kind of detect my kind of rather boring conversation analytic background here, is the importance of sequence here. In interaction, things happen in sequences. There'll be one thing happen, and the thing will happen afterwards. There's a question, and then there's an answer, most simply. And here, as you have the family getting ready to cross the road and the car approaching, they stop for the car to go. They yield, go. But the car itself then stops. And actually what happens is even worse. The car stops, the people start to move, and just as the people themselves start to move, the car then goes again. And you'll often see with a lot of these systems that they get stuck in these little kind of back and forth like this. The thing to kind of take away from this is that pauses for humans are not just null operations. They're not just things you do when you just don't know what to do. We use pauses to do things. And of course, in our face-to-face interactions, we do things with pauses, be that as part of talk, be that part of movement, be that part of driving. And pauses in this case are part of yielding. Okay, let's jump in a little bit more and look at a third and the final example with cars that I'll show you today. This is a different system. This is the Tesla system here. But I want you to show you a little bit of how it gets stuck in this four-way junction. This is a San Francisco four-way junction. You'll know the cars come from different directions here, and you have to yield and go in the right way to get through this this kind of four-way, because you've got stop signs on the cars coming in. Well, again, the Tesla does actually, the self-driving car does actually get through this junction here. I want to just kind of suggest that possibly I don't think it's that safe. And actually, often you find accidents come from the accumulation of small mistakes. And so I actually think in the sense this is actually the start of understanding why some of these cars might actually not be that safe. But we're going to start by just looking at the Tesla, and I'm going to helpfully count for you the number of cars that go before the Tesla. Okay, three. 5 cars go before the Tesla, and clearly this isn't particularly smooth way of getting through the junction here. The challenge here again is just this problem about being able to understand when to go and when to yield. But it's actually slightly more intricate than that. And if you're actually looking at in detail, there's something quite interesting about the way in which the car here slows, but the Tesla doesn't move fast enough. And so, well, the blue car just goes then, and then the Tesla then brakes. it's not just about sequence here. What's kind of interesting here is the way in which we mutually adjust what we're doing in concert with other people. And so we're actually watching, and is this person going to go? Am I going to go? And there's this kind of mutual adjustment that takes place, that the Tesla just simply doesn't react fast enough. It doesn't go when it should go. Mondada has talked about this when she's been looking at kind of human-to-human co-present interaction as the way in which there's not just sequences in our talk, in our interaction, but also that we're always continually adjusting ourselves in response to what the other person has done. And this has actually been a kind of move away from thinking about things sequentially in interaction to think about them more about how they're more embedded in each other. And I think this is appropriate for thinking about these sort of driving situations. Okay, so I think this is interesting. I think this is kind of nice to look at these emergent systems to see some of the mistakes they make. I have to say there's been constant improvements in the system over time, but still they struggle with this pretty basic form of traffic interaction, which is yielding. And as you'll see there, I've tried to kind of like dig in and actually try and bring out some of the importance of sequence and timing. But again, what's this got to do with HCI? Well, I think this is important stuff for thinking about human-robot interaction, because I believe that sequencing and timing are important for human-robot interaction. And I think this is one of the contributions that we can make to, as it gets known, human-robot interaction, HRI, to bring some of the kind of stuff that we've been doing in HCI and bring it into HRI, which I think as a field is still very evaluative in terms of how it thinks about human-robot interactions, rather than thinking about them a little bit more in this kind of detailed way that I'm doing here. And this leads me on to my second case, which is a case where I'm looking at some robots. This is work just presented at CHI just a couple of weeks ago with my colleagues at Cornell Tech in New York. And this is kind of interesting stuff. I think it kind of tries to draw some of the lessons from the self-driving car stuff to try and think a little bit about how we might design something like a trash robot here, which is moving around a square and trying to collect trash. But let me tell you a little bit more about the robot in a second. So as I say, this collaboration was with Wendy Zhu and her group at Cornell Tech. And it's kind of a bit of a mix of, she's got a much more design approach, and I've obviously got this more kind of conversation analytic approach to thinking about how we might design and understand movement, and particularly movement around robots. And I go back to the same point that I was trying to illustrate with the car stuff about trying to look at the moment by moment unfolding nature of interactions around robots. Okay, so what did we actually do then? So this was a 1-week trial of a robotic, 2 robotic trash cans in a New York square. It's a Wizard of Oz trial, which you'll be familiar with, I'm sure, but just to kind of make it clear that there's not any intelligence in here, the robots are actually being remotely controlled. The trash cans are being remotely controlled by local operators. Interestingly, there was a post-trial consent, which has to say we asked for consent for people after they'd interacted with the trash can, which I'll touch on in a second. And actually, the videos I'm going to focus on here come from the first trial in this New York square, which you might recognize in New York. But actually, the trial's actually expanded and it's been tried out in other different kind of areas in New York since then. Okay, let's have a look. So this is just, there we go. Here. This is the square, by the way. This is the videos I'm going to play are the view from the trash can. There's cameras that are mounted on the trash can, and this give you kind of a particular viewpoint on the interaction. And well, let's just jump in and have a look at what happened. So the first kind of interaction I'm going to talk a little bit about is oh, there we go. That's it playing there. Some of the interactions you see as it moves around. So the first interaction I want to talk a little bit about is when people offer something for the trash can, and the trash can comes up to pick that up. Okay, pretty straightforward, isn't it? I'm going to play that one more time for you. So there's this person in the square, they hold out about trash, the little trash can comes up, positions itself in the right spot for the trash to be delivered and goes into the trash can. It can go on a slightly more complex way. For example, sometimes the trash can can get delayed moving over the environment of the square. Oh, that one on play. So you'll see there that she's kind of got this bit of trash and she thinks, oh, it's not coming actually, and she takes the trash back. But then, oh, actually it goes around the other side and the trash does get delivered. First thing I want to say about that is just simply that this behavior, this kind of offering things for the trash can, was spontaneous. There wasn't any instructions, there wasn't anything in the square telling people what was going on. So it's kind of quite interesting to see this spontaneous behavior arise of holding trash out for the trash can. It's also a pretty simple interaction. It's not confusing. I played it a couple of times there, but you could kind of see what was going on. But it can get complex. And this is a clip I'm going to play, which is kind of like the reverse behavior from that one. This is where the trash can initiates. I'll play that one more time. So you see there's these two trash cans, they come up, they may obviously make a little bit of rumbling noise. He notices them, looks around at them. We call this ask and receive because you have this kind of the trash can coming up and actually getting the kind of trash. Now, as with the examples I gave of the car, I was emphasizing this point about the sequentiality of some of these interactions. And I think that's quite important to understand there, and perhaps slightly neglected in work around human robotic interaction, is the sense that there might be a sequence going on here, that you might have something happening like a request and then something following after that request. For example, going up, asking for trash by your position and then getting the trash back. There's sequences going on here. There's also, I think, interesting to talk about the systematic nature of the interactions here with these trash cans. No, I'm not making a huge claim here. These are pretty simple interactions, as I've already said. But I think they're fairly systematic. And even though we didn't have any instructions in the square, I think there was actually quite distinctive, systematic, repetitive patterns of behavior that did occur in the square. Okay, now that's quite nice, I think, as it is. But there's also some cases, of course, where you're just using it as it's going past. And we called these drive-by uses, where you just got the trash can going past, and then you're just like, this guy, throws a bit of trash in there. Or this case here, which is one of my favorites, where a guy comes from over here, sees the trash can, goes around it, throws a bit of trash in there. What's kind of fun here is you don't normally see robotic trash cans, or at least I don't usually. And this guy just kind of uses this trash can just in the few seconds within the first few seconds of seeing the trash can in the square. Of course, there's also a whole bunch of stuff around movement with these trash cans. And of course, I kind of saw some kind of behaviors that reminded me of the kind of previous work on the cars with the sort of yielding and these kind of standoffs that you get here. So let me play some of those kind of clips here. So this is one where the trash can yields, stops for the person to go. And then this one here is a little bit more complicated, where you've got someone getting a little bit confused about what the trash can is doing and then going around it like that. And you think, if we're going to have these robots in public spaces, these are the kind of challenges and things I think we have to actually kind of think about, is how are these movements going to unfold, and how can we actually think about how we're going to design these kind of objects so that they can actually yield, or indeed sometimes perhaps not yield perfectly, not cause too much confusion for people who are around them. So I'll return to my earlier point about this. These are being human controlled. There's not any kind of computer intelligence in these. This is a Wizard of Oz trial. So this is, if you will, the best case that we could imagine for these kind of systems. But I think they kind of show us a hint at maybe some of the emergent behaviors that we might get if we were actually had kind of kind of the perfect kind of technology, perhaps, or at least kind of good kind of technology as we have when we have somebody controlling them manually. So this is a kind of a bit of a kind of bridge paper between HCI and HRI. And I was kind of jokingly saying that this paper, the theme of this paper is to make HRI HCI again, which by the point I'm meaning that I think there's been lots of interesting developments in HCI in the last sort of 15 or so years. And particularly one of the things is this work on really kind of trying to think about the moment by moment unfolding nature of human interaction and how we can apply that to thinking about robotic interaction. And I think there's a lot of kind of aspects of HCI which I think are relevant. Most importantly, diversity and how the different methods that we use that I think are relevant to human robotic interaction. In the paper, I dig in a little bit more deeply into this SSSS framework, that these interactions are spontaneous and simple and sequential and systematic. I won't labor that too much here today, but I think this maybe at least gives us a start for thinking about things that we can use to think about how we might design these little movement interactions that we have, be that with self-driving cars or with robots that are in a public square. Cool. Okay, I showed you a lot of videos today, so thank you for keeping with me. I know there can be a kind of lot of work to get through, but I think as a method, it's nice because, as I say, it gets you actually kind of a chance to go there and look at actually some kind of detail about some cases that are actually occurring. So obviously, the first kind of stuff I've shown you was about these cars and this, and I think first point to make, self-driving cars are a form of robots, and I think they're actually, if anything, probably one of the most predominant forms of robots that we are likely to encounter. And I've tried to explore a little bit in that car stuff, trying to bring out this idea of movement as an HCI problem, as a form of interaction that we might think about, both for in terms of understanding as also to things that we might design for. The things that, the things I kind of brought out for there was the importance of sequentiality and mutual adjustment. And I think you can also see a little bit about how you can kind of draw that through in the work that I've just been doing recently on robotic interactions. And of course, I had this kind of thing about these interactions being spontaneous, being simple, being sequential, and being systematic. So the next step, of course, to go from this is to think a little bit about how we might design movement as an HCI problem. And as I give you a little bit of forewarning that this work is kind of just emergent just now, which is the sense of like, can you think of movement as a design material? If you will, can you think about how we might have to design movements so that in interaction with others, it's something that's going to make sense and we can make sense of others' interactions. And I've kind of like been playing around with this idea of trying to build a technology that can do a yield just as a start initial point here. So this is a robot that we've got in Copenhagen, and it's our first attempt at something. It's a carrying robot. In this case, it just kind of goes around, and what we're trying to design it to do is to follow around after you. And so if you're cleaning up, say, beer bottles from a party, it'll go around and you can put beer bottles in it. And one of the initial kind of problems that we're trying to look at is the problem of the door. So it turns out that having a carrying robot can be quite useful, but you often have to go through doors. And the interaction that's involved to actually get through a door is quite intricate and involves, of course, the yield as a pretty basic thing. Are you going to hold the door for the robot? Or is the robot going to go first? How's it going to work? So you have to kind of use this as a kind of trying to use this work to understand how then in turn we can design this carrying robot so that it will be able to actually carry things for you. So I think this this is quite initial work, but I think it's kind of an interesting problem. And actually, of course, if you're actually going to build robots, I would recommend using this method. This is a hoverboard that we ripped apart and put on the side of a little dolly, and that works really, really well as a kind of robot that you can build. Okay, so let me kind of sum up some of this work here. So robots are increasingly becoming part of public space in different ways, be they delivery robots, be they cleaning robots, be they even lawnmower robots in different ways. And I think this is a kind of an interesting space, and maybe something that we shouldn't just leave to our human robotic interaction colleagues, but we should actually take on as a kind of prominent issue in HCI. How do we design movement? How can we design movement in interaction so that it makes sense to those who are around, and that as we produce those movements, we can understand others interactions. And as you'll see in this work, I've tried to always do this thread of bringing sociology and design together to try and solve this problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. So we've got time for questions, lots of time for discussion. Over to you. We're going to pass this around, not for amplification, but for the people on there.
Thank you, Barry. Really great work. Lots of questions. Can you tell us a bit more about the trash project? Like, was it just a bridging experiment, probe, or did anyone really think that like people like need the trash can to come to them rather than standing up and walking to it? I'm just curious in a very banal way about that to start with.
So yeah, one of the things, there's lots of clips where people are interacting with their kids with the trash can. And one of the things that's quite nice about those clips is you get them explaining the trash can to their kids, right? So it's kind of quite nice, like, oh, this is, I don't have to interview them. We actually did that. We did actually interview them, but we don't actually have to, we don't actually have to do that. And there they say, you know, they say things like, oh, it's a robot that's going to help you. And they start saying things like this. And then I think there's one case I can remember particularly where there's someone on the side who says, there's a person inside that. So guessing then that it is like a Wizard of Oz. But I think in a sense, that's maybe not the most important thing there is to, the more I guess I'm kind of looking at is not what they're thinking about it, because I think that's maybe a way in which a lot of the HRI stuff's kind of got a little bit in the wrong direction. But actually just look at how people behave around it. And people use it all the time as a robotic trash can, not just as a trash can. So there's lots of you know, predicting where it's going to be and walking towards it. There's also lots of these kind of drive-by uses where people, as I say, go past like this, and lots of waving of trash and it coming up and them finding trash for it. There's also some demonstrations which you talk a little bit about in the paper where, you know, there'll be like a kind of, particularly for kind of children, they'll be like, oh, you have a bit of trash, and then they drop some trash and then they drop trash in it. So kind of interesting sorts of behaviors there. So yeah, it's lots of interesting stuff, I think, kind of coming out of that experiment.
But was the original intention for it to be like a research device, or is it actually proposed as sort of a useful thing that like if you don't bring the trash can, then people won't walk to the static trash can?
So Wendy's done earlier work on robotic furniture. So she has this kind of robotic ottoman that she was kind of experimenting with, where it would kind of go around, and she's very interested in these kind of movement interactions and how you can design them in terms of the robots. So I guess it's like a field trial. It's a kind of field trial, right? Just to try and understand a little bit like, well, what is this emergent thing that might possibly be something that you'd have? There's another question, which of course is, why would you want a robotic trash can? Can't you just walk over anyway?
Yeah.
But that maybe I can answer that in another time.
Okay.
So I guess all the examples that you showed were mostly in outdoor spaces. I was wondering if you think the same kind of behaviors would apply, say, in an indoor space like the home, where you've got things like Roombas that might exhibit some of these things. But would you say they apply in that space as well?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't. I own a Roomba, so I've only got kind of that kind of interest in it. But the beer robot we've kind of been using in a bar. So it's a student bar, though. So it's also, I think you're right, there is a lot to do with the kind of contingencies of the space that have a big impact on what expectations you have there. Even, for example, a New York Square in one part of New York can be very different from a New York Square in another part. So, for example, the most recent trial was in Brooklyn, and that was a different kind of square than this one here, which is a kind of in the center of New York Square. I've done a lot of kind of work in urban spaces, and I know you have to be sensitive to the kind of people who, for example, some people live in squares, right? And so you have to be very sensitive to that and the different roles that people play in those sort of spaces. So yeah, different public spaces, different, and I've kind of glossed over that a lot, just talking about public space generally. But I think, yeah, there is a kind of quite a lot of variety there. Yeah.
Good. Very quick, I'm going to pass it to you, Anne, but just very quickly, it's like you're showing this one here, but isn't it like the Milton Keynes one where they kind of like turn the robots upside down, right? You know, have a bit of fun with them and
Yeah, the Starship robots from Milton Keynes. Yeah, there's actually quite a nice paper talking about that. They're also deployed in Finland, saying that in Finland people help them because they particularly have troubles with the snow, and that they help them because the robots are kind of cute. I don't know what to make of that argument, actually. I think it's also, but it's still kind of quite an interesting thing just to sort of say, like, okay, people are helping the robots, whereas maybe in Milton Keynes, they're, no, I don't know, anyway.
Thanks, Barry. That was a great talk. I guess I want to explore the idea of the AI learning a bit more. So if I try driving in the US, I really struggle with four-way stops because we don't have them in the UK in the same kind of way. And it takes me several days, if not weeks, preferably with an American in the car who can tell me the protocols, before I start to feel comfortable with those, what to me is an unfamiliar and different kind of road interaction with other users. So in a way, I'd sympathize with that Tesla. You know, I think I would probably have been there for just as long as the Tesla was. So, I mean, as a question, obviously you're viewing these videos, I assume, as an outsider who doesn't have any more insight than I might have into the thinking of the developers about how it might or might not be learning about different kinds of interactions, which apply, you know, like for me as a foreigner going into the US, but also apply, you know, every different country in the world has different road protocols. You know, Anisha and I were talking about driving in India or sub-Saharan Africa the other day. That's a really, really different kind of driving experience that requires a very different kind of negotiation with other road users. So kind of, what do you understand about learning negotiation in different social contexts? I mean, I guess you sort of hinted at it just now in your mention of different squares in New York, but it's a kind of bigger question than that, I think.
Yeah, and driving is an interesting one. So I did a project before this work with Nissan, and they're super interested in cultural differences. And so the work that came out of that, we did a paper on looking at horn use in India, which is, I think, kind of quite different from some other places, how horns are used, because there's a lot more of a, it means watch out, I'm here, kind of there. So I actually think the cultural differences argument can be overplayed a little bit, because one of the important things about different countries is they're very different road environments, right? Firstly, the sorts of vehicles are different there, the conditions of the roads, the amount of pedestrian and motor traffic that's mixed can be very different. So I think you kind of alluded it to there that, you know, you'd learn, right? So, you know, your point is that you would kind of get used to it. And so I actually think that that it's not like it's a completely different sort of driving, right? After a little while, you learn how to do it. And similarly in America. And so I think that this idea that we'll need a completely different driving operating system for different countries, I'm not really sure about, because I think. Oh, right.
Which is about how does one develop the learning in order to be able to adapt to different contexts? Because you didn't mention that, and that seems to be an important part of social interactions, is that we learn the protocols for different social contexts. I was just using, you know, that international driving context as an example of, we each have to learn different protocols, ideally supported with a local who sort of understands it a bit better than you do if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah.
So how might these autonomous vehicles learn in those kinds of ways?
And I don't think I have a good answer, but maybe the kind of one thing to think a little bit about is, of course, the difference between, with all these models, there's a learning phase, right? Whereas this training phase, and then there's actually like a kind of, well, it'll do something around the prompt if you've got a particular system, right? So I think that's kind of interesting to think about. We, like as humans, do we have that kind of divide? I guess we do to some extent, right? But I think that's maybe the way that I would go into to try and think a little bit about that, is because a lot of these driving systems, obviously there's a training where, you know, they throw lots of, you know, millions of training situations at some neural net, and then they have a kind of driving sort of phase where its learning will be quite limited. And I think the way they kind of solve it is they go, okay, let's add more, let's load in some India data or whatever, you know, sub-Saharan African data, and then they'll produce a different form of driving. So I think that's how they approach that problem. I don't know if I'm really answering your question though.
So very interesting talk. Thank you. Lots of food for thought. I know you mentioned the Roomba at some point as well. And then we were talking about these two different contexts of movement. One was a very safety critical context where you're in a car and the self-driving car is sort of trying to make decisions, and safety overrides a lot of things, I assume. And then the second one was a more playful but Wizard of Oz thing. So I feel like am I right in assuming that there were people controlling those trash cans? And so the interactions, I assume, if they're rule-based within an object, would be different from the way a person would probably use these interactions. So I'm trying to make parallels between, for example, the Roomba, which is probably demonstrating some bottom-up behavior, some basic bottom-up behavior, like avoiding obstacles and not bumping into things, but maintaining some form of separation, for example. So how do you think we could test for more sort of emergent, natural interactions in terms of movement in these kinds of contexts? And is there room for that really? Because there is a lot of research that looks at that kind of movement. I mean, we've observed things in the wild. We've got all of this research around boids and animal, you know, and a lot of movement based, a lot of robotic movement is based on those emergent interactions, but these were quite different. So I'm trying to understand how we would, from an HCI perspective, try and merge those two perspectives, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I can answer the question in two parts. First,
Of course.
let's talk a little bit about so there's this interesting idea of automation, which is that a lot of the time when we think something is automated, it's actually human controlled. So for example, I know with the Cruise self-driving car, before it had some problems, it was actually human controlled about 20% of the time. So a lot of, I think that actually, and actually, of course, it's revealed that for many systems that are supposedly automated that we're using, there's often somebody behind them actually doing stuff with them. So I think actually while it might seem there's this distinction there that there's computer control in the car case, and there's like this Wizard of Oz with that, I think actually I would kind of say that's a little bit more kind of mixed, actually more complex there. But I think your main question is actually this one about that these are two very different situations, and maybe I think you're probably maybe suggesting maybe they're incomparable, maybe we can actually draw lessons from them. So my actual point is actually that I think there is some simple things like yielding or sequences, for example, that might actually, these cases, I mean, I'm not the first person to talk about these, as I said there, but these cases of robotic interaction illustrate some of these concepts, which I'm taking from other people. And actually, I don't see a lot. I mean, the HRI stuff, of course, there's a lot of different stuff there, right? So, but generally, the concept of sequence, I think, isn't well developed there. And so I hope that I can, in this work, take that trajectory through these different examples to still make stuff that's relevant to the design of robots.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I have a couple of questions. So the first one is, so you are interested in the interaction between essentially the user, so the person that is not a driver, the non-driver, and what is around the car, because like from that view, it is the view of the person that is in the car. So which kind of interaction are you interested in? That is the first question. The second question that I have, so for that, because which kind of interaction are you interested in? It is the interaction of the car, or is the interaction of this is essentially the perception of the person that is in the car that is experiencing the fact, this kind of autonomy that is in front of their eyes?
Yeah, so the point I'm interested in, the thing I think that's the interesting interaction there is between the car and other road users, right?
Okay.
And as you're right, the perspective I've got is a
Yeah.
unusual one for that, perhaps, because I'm inside the car with the driver or the passenger.
Yes. Oh, because that was like a, I think there is like a piece here, interesting piece of research of the perception of the users. So I was thinking it would be interesting to have another camera that is like it is essentially capturing the actual people that are in the car to see their reaction.
Yes, and actually a lot of the videos do have that.
Okay.
And it's absolutely fascinating because it's this kind of interesting testing thing. So in HCI, we had this thing where we still do, of course, do lots of work in labs, but we did a lot more work. We expanded it to do more field tests. And there's almost an analogy with what's actually happened with this industrial testing is now these systems get tested out in the field here. And so we can see that with these self-driving systems, because you couldn't really test them in a lab, really. Or you can, but not to the same extent.
And another thing that I am aware that Waymo that has also instrumented some crossroads around the UK for sure, where they capture all the data. So it'd be interesting to look at, because they capture essentially the position of all the cars, and then they model the cars and the way essentially, because they essentially put their car in the crossroad, and then they look at all the reactions of cyclists, pedestrian, other cars, other drivers, with respect to their car. So they essentially they repeat the experiment again and again, and they collect a lot of data about that, because then they can also improve the way the car essentially behave in this situation. So it'll be interesting to essentially to mix that type of information that comes from cameras that are essentially on the street, because these are cameras that are also very, very high. I saw the images, so they have some sort of view of the entire crossroad or the intersections and what you see inside the car. So I was thinking like combining the two would be quite interesting, because like you get the GPS location of all the move essentially the cars, the pedestrian, and so on that are in an area.
Yeah, and I should say one weakness of the YouTube data is we get a quite partial view. As you say, we don't get this kind of nice overview. Actually, I have a PhD student who was in San Francisco, and he was cycling after Waymo's to try and get different viewpoints. But we for various reasons that didn't work out as well as we thought it could do. But we do have a paper which is looking at people honking at the self-driving cars, which is a kind of a little way of thinking about that. But yeah, but we're limited, of course, by the data that we've got here.
No, I was thinking like this might be like something that you might think to work with Waymo, the other companies that are instrumenting streets in order to do this type of studies. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
I always enjoy watching. No, I know, I wouldn't be so cruel. I always enjoy watching your vignettes because they do somehow capture the essence of what you're then explain. But one of the things that struck me, and I've seen quite a few of these robots in action, only yesterday at UCL East, we have the robots in the cafe that deliver meals. And it's really interesting that there are other behaviors that get elicited, so playful, mischievousness, and just completely ignoring it. And I wondered whether we need to argue for design principles along the lines you're saying, maybe for the autonomous cars, but for these types of robots, the one you've got on the right here, do you think we need to come up with design principles, or do you think people will just sort of play with them or interact with them like they might do with a pet? So we don't really need to have necessarily come up with new rules as to how to interact with pets, but maybe you think that. So I'm just wondering that they elicit playful and mischievous behaviors amongst many people rather than, trying to yield or avoid. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's early days, isn't it? Right. So I think obviously like both, right? I mean, obviously kind of it's good to have some kind of stuff to guide what you're doing. But yeah, I don't think we really know. I mean, like the battery technology has been what's held us back, right? We've just got to the point where the things will last for 20 minutes, right? Which is actually already kind of so many applications you can't really use them for, but we're just kind of getting there. I think the kind of the interesting and more difficult case, and I was talking a little bit about this when we were just before, which is the military use of these technologies for drones. And I think there the battery technology has actually been rather advantageous in what is held back. But I think there we have a different set of concerns. So I think, yes, playful, but also I think there's also a whole other domain here we have to think about. Thanks.
Just on time. Thank you again, Barry.
Thanks for the question. Good questions, thank you.